History Month you find
ridiculous?
Why?
You're going to relegate my history to a month?
Oh, come on.
What do you do with yours? Which month is White History Month? Well, come on, tell me.
Well, I'm Jewish.
Okay, which month is Jewish History Month?
There isn't one.
Oh, why not?
Yeah.
Do you want one?
No.
I don't either. I don't want a Black History Month. Black history is American history.
How are we going to get rid of racism?
Stop talking about it. I'm going to stop calling you a white man.
Yeah.
And I'm going to ask you to stop calling me a black man. I know you as Mike Wallace. You know me as...
All right.
Hey, get your hands off me, grave digger. What?
Damn it. Does the whole world got to stomp in your face?
Nigga, you better get your hands off me.
Ain't no niggas around here, you hear me?
Oh, I see. So the white man give you a couple of stripes. Next thing you know, you hollering, ordering everybody around like you the master himself. Nigga, you ain't nothing but the white man's dog.
What are you? So full of hate you just want to go out and fight everybody. Because you've been whipped and chased by hounds. Well, that might not be living, but it sure as hell ain't dying. And dying's what these white boys been doing for going on 3 years now. Dying by the thousands. Dying for you, fool. I know, because I dug the graves. And all the time I'm digging, I'm asking myself when, oh Lord, is going to be our time. Well, time's coming.
In this video, I would like to explore the concept of black patriotism. Can a black man or woman in this country honestly call themselves patriotic when you consider everything that's been going on? There was multiple reasons why this stuff was left out of history. And were there any other people that we never thought of that had a part in the revolution?
The richest parts of American history is black history, and yet today so many of us know so little about it.
Many of our greatest revolutionary heroes were patriots of African descent.
We have so many cool stories of black and white serving together, fighting together in the revolution, and yet what we hear today are the real victim stories, which are there. No question they're there, but that's only a part of American history.
Many courageous and effective black leaders played pivotal roles in our government as early as the late 1800s.
If you're going to talk about...
It goes against the traditional victim narrative. After the Civil War, the history was actually written by the losers. That's the one time in history where the losers wrote the history.
That's exactly right.
Really interesting.
You may say, what's the problem with victimization? We were victimized. Why not showcase it? We should showcase it. But to talk about that at the exclusion of the other is basically to handcraft a future generation of young people to believe the world owes them something, and they won't, strive for anything and never know their potential.
I think he's the most brilliant scientist in American history. This guy, unbelievable what he did. He's the guy
more so than Franklin?
I would put Franklin and Banneker almost equal. Now, Franklin did a lot of inventions. This guy one time took a pocket watch. He taught himself how to read. He taught himself science. He wrote an almanac that 10 years ahead he was able to predict to the minute solar eclipses, lunar eclipses, 10 years before they happened. I mean, by watching the motion through a telescope, unbelievable what the guy did. He once took the back off a pocket watch, saw how it worked, went home and carved a wooden clock with all the gears, mainspring, and it was accurate to within 1 minute a year. A wooden clock the guy did. He's the guy who laid out Washington, D.C. He's the surveyor who did all that. He's a brilliant mathematician. Jefferson gave him...
Never knew this.
No. Jefferson gave him his example to France, said, hey, you guys in France think that blacks are inferior? Here's Benjamin Banneker.
Okay, I have Jefferson. 2 minutes total. Start with...
James Armistead.
Yeah,
it's a great one. Because James Armistead, after the Battle of Richmond, he's in Virginia, and a lot of the battles do not happen in Virginia. But after the Siege of Richmond, he's there, he sees what the British have done in his home state, and he goes to enlist. He said, I want to help. And he really, I don't know why, but he liked Lafayette. He went to Lafayette, young French general, 19 years old, said, I want to fight with you. And so they make this agreement, and what happens is James Armistead goes over to Benedict Arnold's camp. He's a British general then, traitor British general, and he says, oh, these mean Americans, they mistreat me. I've escaped as a slave. Please let me stay with you. And Arnold says, okay, you can wait on us. And so he is part of Benedict Arnold's staff, waiting on Benedict Arnold. And Arnold's one of the generals, which means he meets with all the other generals. So he's meeting with Cornwallis all the time. And so James Armistead is just serving them and doing all the right stuff and just picking up intelligence like crazy. Every day he gets back with Lafayette, says, here's what they're doing, here's where they're going, here's what they're going to do next. And he kept feeding the information back. And Cornwallis in this time got really comfortable with James and said, you know, I don't want to ask you to do something you don't want to do, but would you consider being a spy against your former guys there, the Americans? Would you be a British spy and tell us what they're doing? He said, yeah, I guess if you want me to, I will. You know, if you're going to force me to, I will. So he goes back.
It'd be tough getting across the lines, though, but I'll risk it for you.
I'll try it.
Right.
So he ends up saying, yeah, I'll do it. And what happens is when they leave Richmond, they decide that they're going down to Yorktown, and they're going to go down there. So what happens is Armistead's fed all that information to Washington and Lafayette. They're going to Yorktown. And he's let the British know that, oh, there's no Americans around down there. It's a real safe place to go. The Americans are elsewhere. So the British the British fleet drops the soldiers off in Yorktown, and the fleet takes off because there's no Americans around. Right then, the French fleet came in and blockaded the port, so the British couldn't get their ships back. And now we've got all the American troops waiting for them when he got up. They're pinned in on the peninsula, can't go anywhere. So he probably cut months, maybe years off the revolution by what he did. Now, it's really cool. He liked Lafayette so much that he went back and got his name changed legally from James Armistead to James Lafayette. He loved Lafayette.
Cornwallis and announces his decision. He'll become a British spy. The commander is thrilled. Then, James hands him documents that he states were stolen from the desk of Lafayette.
He doesn't really understand what these documents say. He just thinks they're important.
Cornwallis examines them, and much to his delight, these suspicions are confirmed. The British commander is concerned that his army at Yorktown is exposed and in desperate need of reinforcement. But the documents indicate that revolutionary troops in the area are dispersed and ill-equipped. So, Cornwallis decides to keep his men where they are.
Cornwallis feels that he is safe, waiting for his own reinforcements to come from New York.
But shortly thereafter, the general is dealt a shocking blow. He and his men are ambushed at Yorktown. Revolutionary forces surround them from the north and south and bottle up the York River, cutting off any means of escape.
Cornwallis is trapped, and he is outnumbered, and he is forced to surrender.
The crestfallen British commander is left to wonder what went wrong. But when he meets with Lafayette to discuss the terms of surrender, Cornwallis discovers the shocking truth.
He looks around the room, and who does he see standing but James? Cornwallis realizes that he's been betrayed.
His trusted servant is a double agent.
The information he was passing to Cornwallis was in fact false information. For Cornwallis, this must have been the largest humiliation of the war.
After this devastating defeat, British forces lose the will to fight, and 1 year later, the war officially ends.
The surrender at Yorktown is the last major conflict of the American Revolution.
As for James, he returns to Virginia, where he eventually secures his freedom and assumes the legal name James Armistead Lafayette. In 1824, in recognition of his heroism, the aging patriot sits for a formal portrait, the very same piece hanging in the Valentine Richmond History Center. And today, this canvas preserves the memory of an unsung hero whose daring deeds helped to free the nation.
Left America in 1784, went back to France. He came back here in 1824 for his farewell tour. Last time he's going to be in America. He's an old man. There's a painting of Lafayette that hangs inside the House chambers, the U.S. Congress, of Lafayette, the old man, on his farewell tour. And everywhere Lafayette went, there were hundreds of thousands of Americans lining the roads. When he went through Richmond 40 years later, he looked over and spotted his old friend James right in the crowd. Picked him out, called him a name. They went and hugged and embraced, and it was really cool.
Why do we not know this story, or
why is it that African Americans particularly are left out of American history?
Well, I think that the answer to that question of why African Americans are left out of American history fits in a bigger scheme of what happens in education. In education, there has been in the last 50 years a real movement to just get God out of history books. We just leave him out. Well, as you look at elements where God has worked, even current polling today, and has for a number of years, shows that the most Christian community in America is the African American community. A higher percent of African Americans are Christians than any other group. So if you're going to talk about African American heroes, by and large, you're going to have to talk about some Christians, and since we don't talk about Christians in textbooks, African Americans really receive the brunt of that. Richard Allen is an African American who became the founder of the first black denomination in America. His is a great story. He was raised as a slave in Delaware, living as a slave on a plantation in Delaware, and a Methodist evangelist came riding across that plantation preaching the gospel. Richard Allen hears the gospel, he gives his life to Christ, becomes not only a Christian, he becomes a zealous Christian. Richard Allen started sharing Christ with everything that moved on that plantation, and shortly the slave master became a Christian. The slave master says, "What am I doing owning slaves?" So Richard gets his freedom. Well, Richard wants to keep preaching the gospel, so he walks out of that plantation, walks out of Delaware, going north. He ends up in Philadelphia. And Philadelphia at that time was the nation's third largest city. There were 40,000 people in Philadelphia. You can imagine that being the nation's third largest city. Richard ends up preaching in a church in Philadelphia where he's preaching to 2,000 people a week. Now, that's a mega church today, but that's really a mega church. But, oh, and by the way, it was a white church that he was pastoring back then. Wow. Wait, they didn't do that back then? Oh, yeah. There are so many examples of black and white together in early American history. There's definitely racial conflict as you go through parts of history, but there was so much cooperation that we never hear about. And so Richard Allen, great patriot that he is, actually becomes one of the soldiers in the American Revolution. So here's a pastor. He's a soldier in the American Revolution. He gets hooked up with signer of the Declaration, Dr. Benjamin Rush. So here's an Anglo, here's an African American, they're working together. It's those two guys that formed the first black denomination in America. The AME denomination was founded by a black and a white working together. Then if you take that relationship, move forward a little bit, what you find is the period of what's called the yellow fever epidemic. The yellow fever epidemic of Philadelphia was 1793. It was terrible. No one knew what caused yellow fever back then, and so it terrorized everyone because they were losing about 120 people a day in the city to yellow fever. They were just dying off. 1/10 of the city died in that period of time. There were about 70 doctors in the city. They all left the city because they're scared to death. They're going to get yellow fever. They don't know what causes it. Well, Dr. Benjamin Rush was one of the very few who stayed in the city. He's called the father of American medicine. And the two guys that worked with him to treat yellow fever, the three of them that worked together to service that whole city, you had Dr. Benjamin Rush, signer of the Declaration, but you had Richard Allen, and you had another black pastor, Absalom Jones. Absalom Jones is the first black bishop in the Episcopal Church, and those three guys treated so much of Philadelphia. So there you've got this huge crisis going on, and what do you have? You have a white and two blacks working side by side to treat that epidemic. Great story of American history, great story of medicine, but we just don't hear it.
First, we talked about the victimization narrative. Second, we talked about what they call separation of church and state, which is really silencing organized religion from public education. And now we're talking about the most obvious racism. It is what it is. You have to wrap your mind around the fact that there's a group within a group within a group who will lie, kill, and destroy for what they think is the greater good. And then they will retell history in such a way that the people arguing against them get
In
blamed
1849, Carlyle published an essay entitled Occasional Discourse on the Negro Question, in which he appealed for a return to some form of slavery.
Occasional discourse on the Negro question, the flow of rhetoric is about the necessity for inequality. Inequality is the proper way to run a society. Those who know should rule those who don't know. Men should rule women, white people should rule black, educated people should rule the masses.
Look at books about race around Darwin's time, they often talk about the Cockney race, the English country race, the Scottish race. There were drawings of the head of a typical member of the Cockney race, and the word was used quite seriously. There were maps made of where the criminal races lived. These were the rookeries. This was the East End, the melting pot of all the horrors that are going to go out and infect the rest of the population.
Race scientists and social reformers visited prisons to study the criminal races at first hand, and among them was Charles Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton. Galton was terrified by the fact that the underclass were reproducing faster than the middle classes. Darwinian law had, it seemed, been turned on its head. The least fit were surviving. Reversing this situation became his mission.
We should note that Margaret Sanger, founder of Planned Parenthood, believed the same thing. We think this is all about skin tone, but ethnic oppression happens within the same race.
I have never seen such piety.
If you watch something like Joan of Arc, you should recall that the English were oppressing and enslaving the French
Unite the people of France. God puts us where he wants us.
in the 1400s. Then if you go back to the 1300s, the English thought they were superior than the Scots, leading to the conflict between the Scottish and the English, and that's where Braveheart came from.
Will you fight? Against that? No! We will run! And we will live. Die. Fight and you may die. Run and you'll live. At least a while. And dying in your beds many years from now, would you be willing to trade all the days from this day to that for one chance, just one chance, to come back here and tell our enemies that they may take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom?
Many countries in Central Europe whose name means slave. Slovakia, Slovenia, Yugoslavia, for instance, means southern slave. Next is political warfare. You can't even begin to deal with the time period of 1700s, 1800s, even early 1900s without acknowledging the fact that the Democrats were the racists and the Republicans were called and created to combat racism. Remember, throw the rock, hide the hand. You should notice a pattern with all of this history is that the people who are vicious and doing the chaos and promoting racism, when they don't get their way or they need to change their program, they always rewrite history in such a way that they seem to blame the very people who are fighting against it, and they get taken out of the picture, or they're like now they're viewed as the saviors of equality.
We must not be guilty of wrongful deeds. Let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred.